In 2019, a satellite imaging drone spotted twisted metal in a remote Alaskan forest. The anomaly, flagged by an algorithm searching for geological disturbances, was almost dismissed as a trick of light on rock. But a second pass, days later, confirmed it. Something man-made, something out of place, lay deep within the unpeopled green. It took weeks for a ground search team, dispatched by state authorities, to reach the coordinates. They battled through dense undergrowth, across terrain no vehicle was ever meant to traverse. What they found was a ghost. A red station wagon, its once bright color dulled by decades of rain and shadow, was half swallowed by the earth. Moss grew thick on its roof and hood, like a living shroud. The windows were mostly gone, shattered outward, leaving jagged teeth of glass in their frames. The tires were flat, cracked, and sinking into the soft forest floor. An air of profound stillness hung around it, the kind that settles after a long, silent scream. One of the rangers, a man named Harris, older, weathered by years in these unforgiving landscapes, ran a gloved hand over the rusted chrome of a door handle. He tried it. Locked. He moved to the next door, and the next, all locked. From the inside, another ranger, younger, peered through a gap where the driver's side window once was. The interior was surprisingly preserved, a dark capsule of forgotten life. Then he saw them. In the back seat, lying open on the faded upholstery, were children's books. Not just one, but two, side by side, their pages riffled by some ancient draft, yet both settled, almost deliberately, on the exact same illustration. A picture of a small cabin in a dark wood, a light in its window, but it was what they found on the windshield that made the chill of the Alaskan air bite deeper. Scrawled in what looked like white marker, stark against the grime and faint remaining frost of some long-ago morning, were three words: "We were followed." The message was uneven, written by a trembling hand, yet fiercely, undeniably there. A silent testament from a lost moment. Who wrote it? And who, or what, were they followed by? The questions hung heavy, as dense as the forest itself. This wasn't just a crash. This was something else. Something that started a long time ago and had waited, patiently, under the snows and summer growth, for this day. The team began the slow process of documenting the scene. Every detail precious. The make and model were soon identified. A Ford Fairmont station wagon, popular in the mid-1980s. The license plate, miraculously, was still attached, though caked with mud. A quick radio call to dispatch, a check of old records, and the first piece of the puzzle slotted into place. Cold and hard. The car belonged to a family, the Miller family. Father, mother, two young children. They had vanished in the summer of 1985 on a planned scenic drive to Glacier Bay. 34 years. 34 years they had been missing, presumed victims of some ordinary road accident, their car perhaps at the bottom of a ravine or swept away in a river. But this was 100 miles from any known road, 100 miles from the route they were supposed to be on. How did they get here? And why did they lock themselves in? The drone had found the car. But the real search, the search for answers, was just beginning. The forest held its breath, guarding secrets it had kept for over 3 decades. The rangers felt it, a palpable sense of tragedy, of fear, that had soaked into the very soil around the rusted vehicle. The children's books, open to that hopeful yet isolated image of a cabin. The desperate message on the glass. It was a story crying out to be told. The news of the discovery sent a ripple through the state. Then further, waking dormant files and stirring old faded memories. The station wagon, carefully winched from its mossy grave, was transported to an evidence hangar in Anchorage. Every fiber, Every speck of dust was now a potential clue. Investigators began the painstaking task of cross-referencing the VIN number, the license plate, with the original missing persons report from 1985. The name solidified. David Miller, 38, an engineer. His wife Sarah, 35, a teacher. Their son, Tom, aged 10, and daughter Emily, just 7. They had packed their red Fairmont for the adventure of a lifetime, a drive up the scenic Alaskan highways, culminating in the breathtaking vistas of Glacier Bay. They'd sent postcards from early stops, cheerful notes filled with the small wonders of the road. Then, silence. Somewhere between one small town and the next, they had simply vanished. Their last confirmed sighting was at a gas station, David filling the tank, Sarah buying snacks, the children eager in the back seat. The attendant, interviewed years ago, remembered nothing unusual, just another family on vacation. Now, 34 years later, this. The car, not in a roadside ditch, but in a place so remote it defied easy explanation. How could a family car end up there? The lead on the resurrected case was Detective Al Rourke, a man nearing retirement, who remembered the Miller disappearance vaguely from his early days on the force. It had been one of many unsolved cases that haunted the periphery of his career. Now, it was front and center. He requested the original files, boxes of paper yellowed with age, filled with dead ends and hopeful theories that led nowhere. He spread out the old maps, tracing the Miller's intended route. Then he marked the spot where the drone found the car. The distance was staggering. Over 100 miles off course, through terrain that even now, with modern vehicles, would be a formidable challenge. In 1985, for a loaded station wagon, it seemed impossible, unless they weren't just lost. Unless that message, "We were followed," was the literal, terrifying truth. Rourke made a call. An hour later, an elderly woman named Carol Jenkins was helped into an interview room. She was Sarah Miller's younger sister. Her face, etched with the lines of a long life, also bore the unmistakable shadow of a grief that had never truly faded. She'd been a young woman herself when her sister, brother-in-law, and her beloved niece and nephew disappeared. For years, she'd held on to hope. Then hope had worn thin, replaced by a dull ache of not knowing. The call about the car had been like a shock to a sleeping heart. "They found it?" she asked, her voice thin, papery. Rourke nodded gently. He explained where, how. He didn't mention the message on the windshield. Not yet. Carol listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. 100 miles. How? She whispered, more to herself than to him. "We thought a bridge out. Maybe they tried a detour, but that far." She looked at Rourke, her eyes pleading for an answer he didn't have. Are they? He told her the car was empty, except for their belongings. The search for the family themselves was ongoing in the area where the car was found. A small, cold comfort. Carol spoke of Sarah, her bright laugh, her love for her children. Of David, a careful, methodical man, not prone to reckless decisions. Of Tom, who loved adventure books, and Emily, who never went anywhere without her favorite stuffed rabbit. She had it with her on the trip, Carol said, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. Bunny. Emily called it Bunny. Did they find a stuffed rabbit in the car? Rourke made a note. The past was no longer a closed book. It was an active investigation, a fresh wound. The discovery of the car hadn't brought closure. It had ripped open the mystery, making it raw, immediate. 34 years of silence, and now the forest had given back one piece, one terribly damaged, enigmatic piece. The red station wagon sat under the harsh lights of the hangar, a silent, rusted witness. The forensics team treated the Fairmont station wagon with the reverence of an archaeological dig. Each item removed was bagged, tagged, and cataloged. The air inside, when they first managed to pry open a stubbornly rusted door, was heavy, stale, carrying the scent of decay, old vinyl, and something else. A faint, lingering metallic tang, almost like old fear. The children's books were carefully lifted. One was The Little House in the Big Woods, open to a page where Pa Ingalls secured the cabin door against the sound of wolves. The other, a lesser-known fairy tale collection, was open to an illustration of a child hiding in a hollow tree while a dark shape passed by in the woods. Coincidence? Or a reflection of the children's last conscious thoughts? The pages were stiff, slightly water-damaged at the edges, but the images were still clear. Beneath one of the books, they found a flattened juice box, its straw still attached. Small, ordinary items, now imbued with a terrible significance. In the front, the glove compartment yielded a map of Alaska, creased and refolded many times. The planned route to Glacier Bay was marked in blue pen. But there was another, fainter line, drawn in pencil, veering sharply off that main route, heading east, into the vast, unmapped wilderness where the car was eventually found. Had David Miller drawn that line? When? And why? The car's cargo area was packed, but neatly. Suitcases, a cooler, camping equipment, tent, sleeping bags, a small stove. It looked like a family prepared for a trip, not one fleeing for their lives. Yet the pencil line on the map, the locked doors, the final message, they screamed of desperation. The cooler, when opened, contained only mold and the desiccated remains of what might have been sandwiches and fruit. There were empty water bottles. How long had they been in the car after it stopped its journey? Days? Longer? The frostproof marker used to write, "We were followed," was found tucked into the side pocket of the driver's door. It was a standard white grease pencil, the kind used for marking on tires or glass. Was it something David kept in the car for emergencies? Or had it been among the children's art supplies they'd surely brought along? Investigators checked the suitcases. Children's clothes, small toys, coloring books. Tom's favorite action figure was there, but no stuffed rabbit. Carol Jenkins' words echoed. Emily called it Bunny. Was it lost before they reached the car? Or did Emily take it with her when they left the vehicle? If they left, the doors locked from the inside. This was the detail that snagged at Rourke's mind. It suggested they were trying to keep something out, not just anyone or anything. Something they believed could be kept out by a simple car lock. Or perhaps it was a last futile act of feeling safe, a symbolic barrier against an overwhelming threat. What could terrify a family so much that they would drive 100 miles into an impassable wilderness, then lock themselves inside their car to await what? The technicians found something else, almost missed. Tucked deep into the springs of the back seat, as if hidden by a small, frightened hand, was a single child's crayon blue. And on the back of the front passenger seat, low down, almost at floor level, were faint, scribbled marks. Not words, just jagged lines, like a child drawing in the dark, perhaps by feel, expressing a terror they couldn't voice. The car was a time capsule of fear. Every object whispered of the family's final days, their mounting dread. The shattered windows, broken from the inside, suggested a desperate attempt to escape after being trapped. Or had they been broken from the outside? By whatever they feared? No. The preliminary report said the glass fragments were mostly outside the car, indicating an outward force. Panic. Sheer, unadulterated panic. The team dusted for fingerprints. Many were found, smudged, overlapping. David's, Sarah's, and smaller prints. Undoubtedly Tom's and Emily's. But there were other partial prints, too faint, too degraded by time to identify easily. Were they from someone else, or just distorted prints from the family themselves? The station wagon had told them a lot. It had confirmed the family's presence, their fear, but it hadn't told them where they went, or what finally happened when the sanctuary of the car was breached or abandoned. The search teams combed the area around where the station wagon was discovered, a slow, methodical grid search. The forest was dense, the ground uneven, covered in a thick layer of decomposing leaves and pine needles that could hide anything. They were looking for any sign, any indication of which way the Millers might have gone after leaving the car, if they had left it alive. The shattered windows, pushed outwards, implied a desperate exit. But why break the windows if the doors were locked from the inside? Unless the locks had become jammed, or they were in such a panic they didn't think to try them. Or, more chillingly, whatever was outside was trying to get in, and they broke the windows to escape what was already with them in the car. But that didn't make sense with the message. We were followed. That implied an external threat. The terrain itself was a puzzle. How had David Miller, an engineer but not an experienced off-road driver, maneuvered a two-wheel drive station wagon, laden with family and gear, through such unforgiving land? For 100 miles? The undercarriage of the car was scraped and dented, testament to a brutal journey. He must have followed animal trails, old, forgotten logging paths, or simply crashed through the undergrowth with sheer, desperate force. What could drive a man to such lengths? Fear for his family. A primal instinct to protect them, even if it meant driving into an even greater, unknown danger. Days into the ground search, one of the volunteers, a young woman with sharp eyes, called out. About 50 yards from where the car had rested, partially hidden beneath a fallen, moss-covered log, was a flash of color. It was a child's sneaker. Small, blue and white, with laces still tied. It was weathered, faded, but recognizably a boy's shoe. Tom's size. There were no remains with it, just the shoe. Had he lost it as they fled? Or had it been removed, placed there? The discovery sent a fresh wave of urgency through the searchers. They were on the right track, or at least a track. The shoe suggested they had indeed left the car and were moving on foot. But in which direction? And why only one shoe? Had Tom been injured? The area around the shoe was examined minutely. They found faint, almost invisible indentations in the soil nearby, possibly footprints, but too degraded by time and weather to be certain. It was as if the forest had almost, but not quite, erased their passage. Rourke arrived at the scene of the shoe discovery. He knelt, looking at the small, lonely piece of footwear. A 10-year-old boy. What was he thinking? What was he feeling? Out here, lost, terrified. The phrase, "we were followed," echoed in Rourke's mind. If they were being pursued, leaving the car made them more vulnerable, unless the car itself had become a trap. Or perhaps whatever was following them was something they couldn't simply drive away from. Something that could keep pace, even in this wilderness. The remoteness of the location was staggering. No roads, no cabins, no sign of human habitation for miles and miles. Just endless trees, mountains, and the chilling silence of the Alaskan wild. If the Millers had left the car, they would have been at the mercy of the elements, and whatever else lurked in those deep woods. Hunger, cold, disorientation, and animals. Bears, wolves. The thought was a dark one. The discovery of the shoe, while a significant find, only deepened the mystery of their subsequent fate. It confirmed they were out of the car, on foot, but painted an even bleaker picture of their chances. A family, alone, one child possibly injured or hampered, struggling through a hostile environment, with an unknown threat potentially still behind them. The search area was expanded, radiating outwards from the shoe. Every broken twig, every disturbed patch of moss, was scrutinized. They were looking for ghosts now, for faint traces of a desperate flight that had happened over 3 decades ago. The forest watched, silent, ancient, giving up its secrets, one tiny heartbreaking piece at a time. The air grew colder as evening approached. The search would have to be called off for the night. Another day gone, and the Millers were still lost, their final moments still shrouded in the deep, dark green. The message, "We were followed," became the focal point of Detective Rourke's investigation. It was the only direct communication from the Millers in their final, terrifying hours. Who could have been following them, and why? Rourke pulled the original 1985 case files again, searching for any overlooked detail, any hint of trouble before the family left for their trip. Friends, neighbors, colleagues of David and Sarah Miller had all been interviewed back then. No one reported anything unusual. The Millers were described as a happy, normal family. No known enemies, no financial troubles, no strange behavior leading up to their vacation. It seemed to be a random, opportunistic crime, if crime it was. Or was it something else? Something stranger? Alaska was a vast state, with a history of unexplained disappearances. People got lost. People met with accidents. But this felt different. The deliberate nature of that drive, 100 miles off course, the locked doors, the message. Rourke thought about the kinds of people who might follow a family on a remote highway. Carjackers? Robbers? But why pursue them so far into the wilderness? Most criminals would want an easy score, not a protracted chase through impossible terrain. Unless the Millers had something specific the followers wanted. Or unless the followers weren't after material goods. What if David Miller had seen something he wasn't supposed to see? He was an engineer. Had his work involved sensitive projects? Rourke made a few calls, checking into David's employment history. He worked for a construction firm, mostly involved in municipal projects. Nothing that screamed espionage or corporate secrets. It felt like a dead end. The mid-story spike in tension came not from a new discovery in the forest, but from an old photograph found deep within the 1,985 evidence boxes. It was a tourist snapshot, taken by another traveler at a scenic viewpoint a day or two before the Millers were last seen. The photo showed a wide vista of mountains, and in the foreground, another family posing for a picture. But in the background, parked by the roadside, almost out of frame, was a blurry image of a dark-colored vehicle, possibly a truck or an old SUV. And standing near it, 2 indistinct figures, seemingly looking not at the scenery, but further down the road, in the direction the Millers would have been traveling. It was grainy, indistinct, easy to dismiss. It probably had been dismissed back in 1985. But now, with the message, "We were followed," fresh in Rourke's mind, that blurry photo took on a sinister new light. Was this them, the ones who followed? He ordered an enhancement of the photograph. The technology was far better now than it had been 3 decades ago. He waited, impatient. Could this be the break? The visual confirmation of the pursuit? While he waited, Rourke considered the psychological aspect. What if the following was imagined? What if, after getting lost or experiencing a frightening but unrelated incident, paranoia had set in? David Miller, responsible for his family, pushed to his limits, might have started seeing threats where none existed. The stress of being lost in such a vast wilderness could unhinge anyone. Yet, the sheer physical effort of that drive, the pencil line on the map, it suggested a tangible fear, a clear, albeit desperate plan of evasion. The enhanced photograph came back. It was clearer, but still frustratingly vague. The vehicle was definitely a dark, older model pickup truck, common for the era. The figures remained shadowy, their features obscured. But one detail emerged. One of the figures seemed to be holding something long and thin, resting on their shoulder. A fishing rod? Or a rifle? It was impossible to say for sure. But the implication sent a shiver down Rourke's spine. This was no longer just a missing persons case. It was potentially a pursuit, a hunt. The term mid-spike in a case usually referred to a turning point. This felt like it. The abstract fear evoked by the message now had a possible grainy image associated with it. Two shadowy figures, a dark truck. It wasn't proof, not even close, but it was a hook, a tangible thread to pull on. Had anyone else reported a similar vehicle or suspicious individuals on that route back in 1985? Rourke assigned 2 junior detectives to re-interview anyone still alive who had been in that area at that time, showing them the enhanced photo, a long shot after so many years. But every long shot had to be taken. The forest search teams, meanwhile, found nothing new for 2 days. The trail from the single sneaker had gone cold. The vastness of the Alaskan wilderness felt oppressive, capable of swallowing any secret, any trace of human passage. The message on the windshield, stark and desperate, felt more potent than ever. We were followed. The words were a direct accusation from the past, challenging the present to find the truth behind them. Reconstructing the Millers' desperate off-road journey became a new obsession for Rourke and his team. How did David Miller, in a 1985 station wagon, achieve what seemed almost impossible? They consulted old topographical maps, forestry records, even spoke to long-retired loggers who knew the region decades ago. Was there an old, forgotten trail system he might have stumbled upon? The pencil line on the Millers' map was studied again. It wasn't a straight line, but jagged, as if tracing a path of least resistance, or a path dictated by something unseen. It veered east, away from any marked roads, into an area labeled on old maps simply as unexplored territory. One of the retired loggers, a man named Jed, his face a road map of harsh Alaskan winters, looked at the maps. He ran a calloused finger over the area where the car was found. There were old survey tracks out there, he said, his voice gravelly. From way back, maybe the 50s or 60s. For mining claims, mostly. Never went anywhere. Most would have been overgrown by the 80s. But a desperate man, he might find traces of them. Traces. That's what the Millers' journey felt like. A desperate clinging to faint traces of hope, faint traces of a path. Rourke imagined David Miller at the wheel, eyes straining, wrestling the car through thickets, over rocks, across shallow streams. Sarah beside him, trying to be calm for the children, who would have been terrified, confused. What were they saying to each other? What promises were made? The sheer physical and mental toll of such a drive must have been immense. Days of it, perhaps. The car's condition attested to the brutality of the journey. The scraped undercarriage, the blown tires. They found evidence the car had been driven on its rims for some distance. It wasn't just a drive. It was a battle against the wilderness itself, fueled by a greater fear of what was behind them. The search teams on the ground were redirected. If David had been following faint, overgrown survey tracks, they might still find evidence along those almost invisible corridors. They used historical aerial photos, trying to discern patterns in the tree growth that might indicate old clearings or paths. It was painstaking work. Days passed. The media attention had faded slightly, but the pressure on Rourke remained. The discovery of Tom's sneaker was the last concrete piece of evidence of the family's presence outside the car. After that, nothing. Then, a breakthrough. One of the searchers, following a barely perceptible depression in the land that might have once been a track, found something glinting in the undergrowth. It was a small silver locket, tarnished and caked with dirt. He carefully brushed it clean. An S was engraved on its front. Sarah's. It was found nearly half a mile from where the sneaker was located. Further along the presumed ancient track, the locket was open. Inside, where tiny photos should have been, there was only empty space, the paper backing discolored. Had the photos fallen out or been removed? Its discovery suggested Sarah had been there, moving along this faint path. It deepened the sense of their desperate flight. They were still moving, still trying. The locket also brought a fresh wave of sadness. It was such a personal item, a piece of Sarah dropped and lost in her terror or exhaustion. The team documented the locket's location meticulously. The faint trail seemed to continue, but it was getting harder and harder to follow, petering out into dense, undisturbed forest. Had they finally lost the track here, or had something else happened? The analogy of time as a slow decay felt potent. Memories faded, like the photograph of the dark truck. Physical traces eroded, like the faint path. The forest was slowly, relentlessly reclaiming everything. But the locket, like the shoe, was a small defiance against that decay. A whisper from the past, saying, "We were here. We fought." Rourke held the small, tarnished locket in his gloved hand back at the incident command post. Sarah Miller. He tried to imagine her, tired, frightened, clutching this, perhaps her last link to a normal life, before it too was lost. The message, "We were followed," wasn't just about pursuit. It was about the loss of safety, the loss of control, the terrifying realization that the ordinary world had fallen away, replaced by a desperate fight for survival in an alien landscape. And still, the biggest question remained: where did their path ultimately lead? Carol Jenkins, Sarah Miller's sister, sat with Detective Rourke again. The discovery of the locket had prompted his visit. He showed it to her. She recognized it instantly, tears welling in her eyes. "Oh, Sarah loved that locket," she whispered, tracing the engraved S with a trembling finger. "David gave it to her for an anniversary. It had tiny pictures of Tom and Emily inside." Carol paused. Then a distant look came into her eyes. Before they left, Sarah was a little on edge. Not herself. Rourke leaned forward. On edge, how? She said David had been quiet, preoccupied for a few weeks before the trip, Carol recalled, her brow furrowed in concentration. She thought it was work stress. He'd mentioned some disagreements at his firm. Nothing specific, just tension. Disagreements. Tension. Could that be connected to the feeling of being followed? It was thin, but it was something. Did she say anything else? Rourke pressed gently. Carol shook her head. No, she brushed it off. Said she was probably imagining things, looking forward to the vacation to clear their heads. But she did make an odd comment the day before they left. She said, "I just wish we could disappear for a while, just the four of us, away from everything." A common sentiment for someone stressed, wanting a break. Or, in hindsight, a chilling premonition. Rourke went back to David Miller's employer. The firm was still in business, though under new ownership. Personnel files from 1985 were archived, buried deep. It took days to retrieve David's. There were performance reviews, project assignments, and then a series of memos. David Miller had raised concerns about safety protocols on a remote construction project he was overseeing. He'd flagged potential environmental violations by a subcontractor. The subcontractor was a locally powerful company with a reputation for cutting corners and having friends in high places. The memos showed increasing frustration from David and dismissive, almost warning responses from his superiors. Could this be it? Had David stumbled onto something more serious than faulty guardrails or improper waste disposal? Had he made enemies? Powerful ones? Ones who might want to silence him, not just discredit him professionally? The idea that the following was targeted, not random, gained traction in Rourke's mind. It would explain the relentless pursuit, the willingness to follow them into such remote territory. These weren't opportunistic thugs. These were people with a specific, dark purpose. He cross-referenced the subcontractor's name with any known criminal activities or suspicious incidents from that era. There were whispers, rumors, but nothing concrete that led to convictions. They were adept at operating in the gray areas. Rourke stared at the blurry photo of the dark truck again. The figures. What if they weren't just random individuals? What if they were connected to this subcontractor, sent to intimidate David? Or worse, the timing fit. The disagreements at work, David's preoccupation, Sarah's unease. The family leaves on vacation, perhaps hoping to escape the stress, to think, and then they realize they are being followed. The decision to turn off the main road, to take that desperate pencil-drawn path on the map, suddenly seemed less like panic and more like a calculated, albeit desperate, attempt to lose their pursuers. They weren't just running from a vague threat, they were running from someone specific, someone they knew, or at least suspected, meant them serious harm. The pieces were falling into place, painting a grim picture. The Miller family wasn't just lost, they were hunted. The silent station wagon, the children's books, the message on the windshield, they were all part of a larger, more sinister story than Rourke had initially imagined. The forest hadn't just claimed them, it had been their last, desperate refuge from a human evil. The search for their remains took on an even greater urgency. They weren't just victims of the wilderness, they were victims of a crime that had remained hidden for 34 long years. The children's books, open to those specific pages, kept drawing investigators back. The Little House in the Big Woods, Pa Ingalls securing the door against wolves. The fairy tale, a child hiding in a hollow tree from a dark shape. Were these choices accidental? Or had Sarah, or perhaps even David, in those terrifying final hours in the car, used these stories to comfort, to explain, or even to instruct their children? The image of a cabin, a light in the window, a place of safety, the image of hiding. The repetition of these themes felt significant. Rourke looked at the crime scene photos of the car's interior. The white frostproof marker used for the message, "We were followed," had been found in the driver's side door pocket. But among the children's belongings in the back, in a scattered box of art supplies, was a similar white marker, though slightly more used. Had there been two? Or had the parent who wrote the message taken it from the children's supplies? It was a small detail, but it felt important. If the marker came from the children's things, it somehow made the message even more poignant. A parent using a child's innocent tool to scrawl a testament of their terror. The locked doors. From the inside, it still bothered Rourke. If they were so terrified of what was outside, why not try to drive further, even on rims, until the car physically could not move another inch? The car was damaged, yes, but was it completely immobilized when they locked themselves in? Or had they stopped, thinking they were hidden, safe for a moment, only to realize their pursuers were closing in? The shattered windows, pushed outwards, also nagged. If they were locked in, why break windows to get out? Unless, as one of the younger detectives suggested, the pursuers had reached the car. What if the Millers, in a last desperate act, broke the windows to create chaos, to try and escape in different directions, to give the children a chance? But then, why no signs of a struggle at the car? No blood, no discarded weapons, nothing to indicate a direct confrontation there. The theory that the following was connected to David's work troubles felt strong. It explained the motive, the persistence, but it didn't explain what happened after the car was abandoned. The family was on foot. Tom had lost a shoe. Sarah had lost her locket. They were vulnerable. Rourke stared at the list of items found: suitcases, camping gear, food, though spoiled. And the children's books. What about Emily's stuffed rabbit, Bunny? Carol Jenkins had been adamant Emily wouldn't have left it behind willingly. It wasn't in the car. This small, soft detail, the missing rabbit, felt like a crucial emotional anchor. If Emily had taken it with her, it meant that even in their flight, in their terror, she had clung to that small piece of comfort. It humanized their unimaginable fear, made it more relatable, more heartbreaking. The investigators re-examined the faint scribbles found on the back of the passenger seat, low down, where Emily might have sat. The jagged lines. Were they just random marks? Or was a 7-year-old trying to draw what she was seeing, what she was feeling? Fear has a shape, a texture. For a child, it might be drawn as sharp, chaotic lines. The focus shifted back to the children. If the parents were trying to protect them, their actions would have been dictated by that primary, overwhelming instinct. The message on the windshield, was it for rescuers or a warning to their children if they got separated? We were followed. A simple statement, yet it could mean so much. It could be a plea, an accusation, or even a desperate piece of information they hoped would somehow survive them. The image of the open books, the same illustration of a cabin, a light, hope, safety, a destination. Had they been trying to reach a place like that? A real or imagined sanctuary? The children, Tom and Emily, were no longer just names on a missing persons report. They were at the very heart of this. Their fear, their parents' desperate attempts to save them, these were the driving forces in those final days. The forest had taken them, but the story of why and how was slowly, painfully, being pieced together from these small, heartbreaking clues. The silence of the car was deceptive. It was screaming a story, if only they could learn to hear all of its words. The discovery of Sarah's locket had given the search teams a new, faint line to follow, but the trail was growing colder, more diffuse with every passing yard. The land here was wilder, the undergrowth thicker. It was as if the Millers had pushed beyond even the faintest traces of human passage and struck out into true wilderness. Rourke felt they were close to something, a final resting place, a site that would tell the end of the story. He authorized the use of cadaver dogs, specially trained to detect human remains, even decades old. For days, the dogs worked, crisscrossing the difficult terrain. The handlers watched them intently, looking for the subtle cues that indicated a find. Then, one of the dogs, a black Labrador named Buster, began to bark insistently, circling a dense thicket of thorny bushes at the base of a rocky outcrop, about a mile from where the locket was found. The area was almost inaccessible. Searchers had to cut their way in, and there, sheltered by the rocks and hidden by the dense growth, they found it. Not a shelter in the conventional sense, but a small, natural depression in the ground, deepened slightly, with fallen branches laid crudely across the top, as if to provide minimal cover. It was barely large enough for one person, let alone four. Inside, the ground was damp, covered in decades of leaf litter, but as they carefully cleared it, they began to find them. Bones. Small at first, then larger. Skeletal remains, scattered, disturbed by animals over the years, but unmistakably human. And with them, heartbreakingly, were remnants of clothing, rotted and faded, but identifiable by buttons and scraps of fabric that matched descriptions of what the Millers were wearing. a child's brightly colored windbreaker, now dull and torn, part of a man's denim jacket, and then, nestled amongst the bones, as if clutched by a small hand even in death, they found it. A sodden, misshapen lump of fur and fabric, Emily's stuffed rabbit, Bunny. It was the definitive, tragic confirmation. The Millers had made it this far. This crude, desperate shelter was their final camp. The remains were carefully excavated, every fragment treated with utmost care. Preliminary analysis suggested the family had not died from violence inflicted by others. There were no bullet holes, no signs of blunt force trauma on the bones that could be attributed to an attack. Instead, the signs pointed to exposure, starvation, dehydration. They had succumbed to the relentless Alaskan wilderness. The twist, if it could be called that, was not a hidden villain leaping from the shadows, but the awful, grinding reality of their end. They had escaped their pursuers, it seemed, driven them off or eluded them in the vastness of the forest. But in doing so, they had plunged themselves into a different kind of peril, one for which they were unprepared. The message, "We were followed," was true. They had been pursued. But their pursuers hadn't directly killed them. They had driven them to their deaths. The men who followed the Millers, the ones in the dark truck, were responsible, even if their hands hadn't struck the final blow. They had set in motion a chain of events that led inevitably to this desolate spot. Rourke stood at the edge of the discovery site, the sounds of the forensics team working carefully behind him. He looked at the crude shelter, the unforgiving landscape. He imagined the family, huddled together, cold, hungry, hope fading with each passing day. David and Sarah watching their children weaken, knowing they had failed to protect them despite their desperate efforts. It was a scene of unimaginable sorrow. The reveal was quiet, somber. No dramatic confrontation, no last-minute rescue. Just the slow, inexorable surrender to the elements, deep in a wilderness that offered no mercy. The forest had kept their secret well. The fate of the Miller family was no longer a mystery, but the knowledge brought no triumph, only a profound, aching sadness. The search for who had followed them, the men connected to the subcontractor, would continue. Perhaps justice, in some form, could still be found for David Miller's courage in speaking out, and for the terror his family had endured. But for the Millers themselves, their story had reached its final, heartbreaking chapter in this cold, lonely place. The remains of the Miller family were brought out of the forest with a quiet dignity. Carol Jenkins was notified. There was a strange mixture of relief and profound grief in her reaction. After 34 years, she finally knew. But the knowing was a heavy burden, the reality of their suffering almost too much to bear. A small, private memorial service was held. The children's books from the car, carefully preserved, were spoken of, symbols of innocence lost. The message on the windshield, "We were followed," became their epitaph, a testament to their ordeal. Detective Rourke closed the active search file, but the investigation into the unnamed pursuers, the shadowy figures from David Miller's work troubles, remained open. It was an old case, cold trails, but he wouldn't let it go. The subcontractor company from 1985 had long since been dissolved, its principals either dead or disappeared into obscurity. But Rourke felt a responsibility to keep looking, to try and attach names to the shadows that had driven a family to their deaths. The red station wagon, after being thoroughly processed, was eventually offered back to Carol Jenkins. She couldn't bear to look at it. With her permission, it was transported to a state historical society's storage facility, a silent monument to a tragedy that gripped Alaska for a time. Some pieces, like the children's books and the frostproof marker, became part of a small, somber exhibit on unsolved mysteries and the dangers of the Alaskan wilderness, a warning, and a remembrance. The site where the family's remains were found, that crude shelter beneath the rocks, was left undisturbed, marked only by the GPS coordinates in a sealed file. The forest would reclaim it. As it reclaims all things, the earth would cover the scars of their final camp. But the story, now known, would linger. Rourke often thought about the Millers, about David's desperate drive, Sarah's attempts to comfort her children, Tom losing his shoe, Emily clutching her stuffed rabbit. He thought about the locked doors of the car, a futile attempt to create a safe space in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly unsafe. The resolution was bittersweet, at best. The family was found, their fate understood, but there was no justice, no real sense of closure for the horror they endured. The wilderness had been the instrument of their deaths, but human fear, and likely human malice, had been the cause. The followed message remained the most haunting part. It was a cry from the past that had finally been heard, but the echoes of that fear would never entirely fade. Some questions, Rourke knew, would always remain unanswered, lost to the passage of time, to the silence of the forest. The truth was a mosaic of small, heartbreaking pieces, and some pieces would forever be missing. The case left a permanent mark on him, a reminder of the fragility of life, the vastness of the wild, and the dark corners of human nature. He'd solved the disappearance, but the tragedy itself felt too large, too profound, to ever be truly closed. The forest kept its secrets, and sometimes, even when they were revealed, they offered more sorrow than solace. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.